to the north actually cuts through the part of the Mediterranean Sea, not the Red Sea. There is a blue line or purplish line that goes kind of through the middle area there, and it goes across some other lake that is there in the land. And then there's a southerly route, which is the red line, which comes down towards the way of the Red Sea. And so scholars kind of debate as to which way they think that the Israelites may have gone. Now, I don't know why they debate this. The text to me seems to be pretty clear as to the path that they took. That green line at the top at the north there, I don't know if you can read that or not, but there's another little line there that's a road. It's a common road. It's the way of the Philistines, right? It's close by to where it is that they're living. It's a northerly route that's going to take them maybe directly into the land of Canaan. But notice in verse 17, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they've seen war and return to Egypt. And so they're not soldiers. They've got a few weapons at this point in time, but they're farmers, right? They're shepherds. They're not soldiers yet, even though they're coming out in orderly ranks, even though they're coming out by their armies, and they are going to someday be on the battlefield. God doesn't want them to see that yet. They're not ready for it. And so he doesn't want to lead them by that. So I don't know how scholars can argue that they took the northerly route and that the sea that they passed through is part of the Mediterranean Sea. That doesn't seem to make any sense with regards to what's in the text. It says in verse 18, God led the people around by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And so it seems to indicate to us that the direction they went in was in the direction of the Red Sea. And that's going to make sense for what it is that God wants to do. God wants to show them something. He wants them to understand something. He wants to have one more victory over Egypt. And he's going to use the direction that he sends them in, I believe, to entice Egypt to come after them. So Pharaoh lets the people go. God doesn't lead them by the way of the land of Philistines, right? He doesn't want them to see war. He doesn't want them to change their mind. He doesn't want them to return to Egypt. They are not to return to Egypt. God does not want them to return to Egypt. He's promised them the land of Canaan. That's where it is that they're supposed to be going. He doesn't want them returning to Egypt. What happens later on that they get out in the wilderness and they complain about, I don't have a touch screen. I'm trying to touch the screen. I need to use my mouse. I don't have a touch screen. What happens later on when they get out in the wilderness and are they happy when they're out there? No. They're complaining, right? And they're griping and they're moaning when they get out in the wilderness. They're always complaining about something. And when the spies go into the land, what do they say when they come back? We're like grasshoppers in their sight, right? There's giants that are there. There's fortified cities, right? There's cities with walls. There are cities everywhere, right? There's people everywhere. We go in there, we're going to have to fight all the time. We're going to have to fight for every inch of land. And there's giants there. How can we defeat? They couldn't see how they could do it, right? And so they come back and they give a report. And after giving the report, notice with me, turn over to Numbers chapter 14. Turn over to Numbers chapter 14. After the spies give the bad report and they say, well, we can't take this land, Caleb and Joshua speak up and they say, no, we can. God's on our side, we can do this. But yet the people wouldn't listen to them, wouldn't believe them. Notice in Numbers chapter 14, beginning of verse 1, it says, so all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried. The people wept that night, and all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. And the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. You know, God can fix that for them, right? If only we had died in the land of Egypt, or only if we had died in this wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us in this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. They were ready to stone Moses and Aaron on this occasion, and to choose, they were going to elect, right, democratically elect a new leader and go back to Egypt because they were afraid. And so God says here, they're not ready yet. Well, they weren't ready later either, because it's going to be at least a year before they get to where the spies go out. Because once they leave Egypt, they're going to travel to Mount Sinai. Once they get to Mount Sinai, they're going to camp there for about a year before they finally head out and then send the spies out into the land. So they're not going to be very much more ready a year later for war and for what it is that they need to do. But God's concerned that they're going to change their minds and want to return to Egypt, and he doesn't want them going back into Egypt. So God led them by the wilderness of the Red Sea. They went up in orderly ranks. It says, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under a solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones up from here with you. This goes back to Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50, as Joseph is near the end of his life, Joseph said to his brethren in Genesis 50 and verse 24, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and will bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And so even though they didn't have anything written yet, they had oral traditions. They knew that at some time, at some point, there was a deliverer who was going to come and was going to bring them out of the land of Egypt. Right? God is going to visit you. He's going to bring you out of this land to the land that he had swore to our fathers. And in verse 25, Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here.
So how many years went by before, after Joseph died, and then his bones were taken? About?
In the neighborhood of 200 to 300 years.
That's pretty good memory, isn't it? Verbal
Yeah.
passing the word along.
Yeah. Because we talked earlier, right, that when Moses sees the two Israelites fighting, he seems to think that maybe he's the one. We could see that maybe he thinks he's the one to be the leader of Israel at that particular time. And the language that he used there, that, why are you striking your companion, seems to be language that a judge would use. And the man accuses him, well, who made you a judge over us, right? Kind of like, who died and made you boss? But Moses seems to think that maybe he's the leader. Well, they would have had this idea that somebody's going to eventually lead them, right? That God's going to bring them out of Egypt at some point. So they fulfill this, right? They bring Joseph's bones with them. Now, in Egypt, they would have had a process of embalming that they would have done, and that goes back to Genesis chapter 50. In the beginning of Genesis chapter 50, it looks like with the death of Israel himself, that they embalmed the body, that there were things that so Joseph was likely mummified according to the Egyptian custom. And so when they bring his bones out, there's, they may be bringing his mummy, if you will, and going to bury that when they get into the land of Israel. I think it's over in Joshua chapter 24 that they bury the bones of Joseph in Shechem there. So they bring him into Israel. They give him a burial in the land that's been promised to them, and they don't leave him behind in Egypt. So they journeyed from Succoth. It says they camped on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went before them, right? There was a pillar of cloud during the daytime, a pillar of fire by night that provided them light, so they could travel by day or by night. Sometimes if you're traveling through a wilderness or if you're traveling through a desert, sometimes it's better to travel at night when it's cooler and try to find some shade in the daytime when it's warmer. But they were able to travel both by day and night. It says in verse 21 that they could go by day and night. And so that pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire is going to be with them as they journey. And really it's going to be with them as they journey over the course of 40 years. That pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud is going to lead them. And when the pillar stops, they camp. When the pillar moves, they march. And so they go or they stay based on what the Lord decides for them. Comments or questions through the end of chapter 13? In chapter 14, it says, Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi-Hiroth, between Migdal and the sea, opposite Baal-Zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, They are bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed them in. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart, so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over his army, all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord, and they did so. So God leads them in a certain direction. He leads them in a certain way so that when they get down to where it is that they're going, they're going to be kind of between a rock and a hard place. They're going to have desert to one side and desert to the other, and they're going to be backed up to where the Red Sea is. And again, that looks like that third line, that red line there, the southerly route there that comes across the rabbit ear there of the Red Sea. When you look at the Sinai Peninsula, it almost looks like you got two rabbit ears there alongside of it. And so it looks like they're cutting across the corner of that as far as when they come across the sea. And so they're not taking a route that's taking them directly to the land that God's going to give them. They're not taking a route that's going directly to Sinai. They're taking a route that brings them out here into a place in the wilderness where there really isn't anywhere to go, where it makes it look like they're lost. It makes it look like, well, maybe their God has left them at this point because they're just kind of out there wandering around in no man's land, don't really know where it is that they're going. And so Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they're bewildered by the land. The wilderness is, look, this is easy pickings. They're out there and they've put themselves strategically in the worst possible place they could put themselves in. God says that he was going to, again, harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them. And now we talked about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. The fact that God issued demands to Pharaoh hardened his heart. He didn't want to give in. He was the lone ruler of the lone superpower in the world, and he was the one who was in charge, and he wasn't going to have anybody tell him what it is that he needs to do. And so the idea that, well, I can still achieve some sort of victory. I can still save face, right? Because here they are, and they've put themselves in this terrible strategic position, and I can go down there, and I can, he who laughs last, right, laughs loudest. I can still go down there and have some victory. I can still save something out of this, and that seems to be what happens here, because of the position that they're in, that Pharaoh's going to think that he can rectify whatever it is that's been lost. Now it was told the king of Egypt in verse 5 that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people, and they said, why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? Boy, you talk about short-term memory, right? Did they forget all of a sudden that the 10 plagues, that why, they're sitting around one day and they're looking around, why did we let those guys go? We had all this free labor. They were making all these bricks for us. We were building all these magnificent things. Why have we done this? Why did we let them go from serving us? The children of Israel are going to have the same kind of short-term memory issues when they forget all the things that God has done for them. And sometimes don't we do the same thing? Don't we sometimes forget all the things that God has done for us and how good God has been to us and the fact that God sent his son to die for us? Sometimes we lose sight of that in the heat of the moment or in the busy life that we have. Our society, man, it's fast-paced. It's go all the time, Isn't there anything faster than McDonald's? Isn't there anything faster than... I know there's places that are faster than Wendy's, trust me. Wendy's is really slow, especially the one on Forks of the River. It's really slow. If you want to spend 45 minutes, we spent 45 minutes in the lobby waiting for our food one Sunday. So they're slow. The microwave, it takes 2 minutes for the popcorn. I want to put in the microwave and boom, I want every kernel popped at once, right? I want something that's fast. We live in a world that we don't want to wait for things, and so we're busy all the time, and we don't have time to wait. We don't sometimes have time to think, and sometimes it's easy for us to forget all the things that God has done for us, all the blessings that God has bestowed upon us. And so they've got short-term memory issues here. So they say, why have we done this? Why have we let Israel go? So he made ready his chariot, took his people with him. Also he took 600 choice chariots and all the chariots of Egypt with captains over every one of them. So he's got 600 choice chariots. They're kind of like the special forces. And then all the chariots of Egypt. So it's not just 600, but it's all the chariots he brings with captains over every one of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He pursued the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with boldness. So Pharaoh's going to come after them. The children of Israel had left Egypt with boldness. Do you think that kind of rubbed Pharaoh the wrong way? I mean, they're leaving like a victorious army. right? They're plundering the Egyptians. They're taking gold and silver and clothing. They're taking all this stuff. They plundered Egypt as they were on their way out. They took their livestock with them. I mean, Egypt had lost the majority of their livestock through hailstorm and through the plague that was on the cattle. And yet Israel has all these things, right? And so the children of Israel had went out with boldness. So the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and overtook them camping by the sea beside Pi-Hahiroth before Baal-Zephon. Now, we're not exactly sure where these locations are. On the map that's behind me, you've got where they're camped is at beside Pi-Hahiroth, which looks to be on the side of the Red Sea that they are on, and that Baal-Zephon is on the other side of the Red Sea. So the Red Sea is between those two locations. They are opposite of that, just like when they come up along the Jordan River and they are opposite Jericho. Jericho's on the other side of the river when they're opposite Jericho on that side of the river later on when they come to conquer the land. So they are opposite or before Baal-Zephon here. When Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, and then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? People see the Egyptian army coming, and they realize there's nothing but desert over here. We can't flee that way. There's nothing but desert over here to protect us. We can't flee that way. There's the sea behind us. And here's the Egyptian army that's riding down upon us. And they were very afraid because even though they've got numbers, even though there's it looks to be in excess of 2 million people, even though they've got over 600,000 men, they're not equipped for battle, and they're certainly not equipped for fighting against chariots. Chariots at the time would be kind of like the tanks of today, right? They were the heavy-duty weapons of war, and the Israelites have none of that, right? And so they cried out to the Lord, and after crying out to the Lord, they complained to Moses, were there no graves in Egypt? That's got to be sarcastic, right? I mean, who took more care and more time in burying people than the Egyptians did? Were there no graves in Egypt? Of course there were graves in Egypt. There's graves all over Egypt, right? There's pyramids and other graves all over in Egypt. Were there no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die in the wilderness? Why have you brought us out of Egypt? Well, if you remember back to the beginning of the book of Exodus, the children of Israel were crying out to God because they were oppressed by the Egyptians. They were put under hard bondage. And so they had cried out to the Lord asking for deliverance. Now they're crying out to the Lord and saying, why did you deliver us? Why did you give us what it is that we asked for, right? Why did you deliver us? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt? And in verse 12, is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than we should die in the wilderness. If you remember when Moses and Aaron first went into Pharaoh and said, let my people go in Exodus chapter 5, and Pharaoh says in verse 2, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? And he tells them, no, I'm not going to let you go. And in addition to that, you just want to go because you got too much time on your hands to think about leaving. You got too much time on your hands to think about having this sacrifice to your God. And so because you don't have enough to do, now I'm not going to give you any more straw. You're going to make bricks without straw. And they had to go out and they had to gather the stubble of the field and try to find straw in order to make their bricks. And they turned to Moses and Aaron and they said, you've made us stink in the nostrils of Pharaoh, right? He hates us now. You've made our life worse, right? And so I don't know if that's what this is in reference to. Isn't this what we told you back in Egypt? Or if it's something else that they said that we don't have recorded for us earlier in the text, that we'd rather serve the Egyptians than have to do things for ourselves maybe, or have to fight for ourselves. But they don't want to die out here in the wilderness. And so they're afraid. And we might understand why they're afraid, because again, they're not soldiers. They're not an army. And here's Pharaoh and his army coming. From a worldly perspective, it looks like they've chosen a very poor spot in which to encamp themselves if they're going to have to fight against the Egyptians, because there's nowhere to run, right? Comments or questions through verse 12? people aren't abandoned, right? They feel like they're overwhelmed, like there's nothing they can do, that the Egyptian army is coming, and they are certainly doomed. But they're not alone here. In verse 13, Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace," or you shall be silent, or you shall be quiet. God's going to fight for them, right? And so notice in verse 13, Casey, you can make a 3-point sermon out of this, right? Do not be afraid, right? Stand still. Don't think that you've got to do everything. That everything doesn't revolve around what your ability is or what it is that you can do. And certainly that's the case with Israel. Everything with Israel doesn't revolve around their mighty power and their military strength. Don't be afraid, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord. God's going to save them from this situation. He's going to save them physically from this situation.
You could add a fourth point from verse 14. Yahweh, or the Lord, will fight for you. Why do you keep silent? The fourth thing could be shut up.
Yeah. Yeah. If you say something, right, you're probably going to, what's the old saying? It's better to remain silent and have everybody think that you're stupid than to open your mouth and remove all doubt, right? Just be quiet, right, and watch what God's going to do. The Lord's got this, right? The battle belongs to the Lord, right, Brian? And so God's going to fight for them. God has been fighting for them. They didn't come out of Egypt under their own horsepower, right? All of those plagues on Egypt should have been a reminder to them that, hey, God's with us, God's with us, God's with us. Here's the Egyptian army coming. Well, what's God going to do, right? That maybe should have been what their thought was. Well, what's God going to do? Instead, they were afraid and said, well, this is the end for us. We're just going to die. You just brought us out in the wilderness to die. And they're going to use that line over and over and over again. Moses, you've just brought us out to the wilderness to die. They forget what happened the time before they said that, right? Well, here they're saying, you brought us out here in the wilderness to die. Weren't there any graves in Egypt? I can't help but think of, Edward G. Robinson, right? Is that the right name? He was the gangster actor that was in the Ten Commandments. He seems miscast as a Hebrew. Hey, Moses, you bring us out here to die? It seems I can't help but think of his voice in that moment, right? That you brought us out here in the wilderness to die. But Moses says, look, these Egyptians that you see, you're not going to see them again. This is the last time you're going to see them. God's going to do this. God's going to fight for you. God, you just need to be quiet and watch, right? Stand still. See the salvation of the Lord. And sometimes their problem is because they don't see a way that they can do it. Because they don't see how they can do it. They don't see how God can do it. Sometimes we don't see how we can do something. Right? How can we get people in this day and age to listen to the gospel? Well, power's not in us, right? Power's in the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. For it's the power of salvation to all who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Power's not in us. Sometimes we think, well, I don't see how I can do this. Well, nothing's impossible with God. God can do it, right? God can do this. Sometimes we just need to be quiet and stay out of the way. We just need to show people the salvation of the Lord for them to be able to see. Sometimes we think, boy, the things that we've done in our lives are so bad that there's no way that God can forgive us, right? We look at things from a worldly perspective and say, boy, if I were the judge and I was judging me, there's no way that I would pardon me because I know what I've thought, I know what I've done. Fortunately, it's not up to us, right? God is the judge, and God, His grace can save us, right? Casey's going to talk about grace this morning in his sermon. So the Lord will fight for you. You shall hold your peace. Verse 15, the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. And God's kind of like, why are you crying about this to me? Don't you remember? Haven't you seen enough yet? Right? Why are you crying to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. Go forward where? Go forward towards the sea, right? Keep marching forward. Even when it looks rough, even when it looks like it's difficult, even when it looks like it's impossible, keep moving forward. Tell the children of Israel to go forward. But lift up your rod, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I will indeed harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So he tells Moses to stretch his rod out over the sea, and he's going to part the waters here, and the children of Israel are going to go through on dry ground. Now, while they need time to do this, it says in verse 19, the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. So they are being led. They are being led by this pillar of fire and this pillar of cloud that they're being led by. But there's someone else that's here. The angel of the Lord, or the angel of God, is here leading them. I think in the New Testament it talks about that rock that the Israelites followed. That rock was who? Christ, right? This angel of God here, this angel of the Lord, appears to be another appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ, that there's deity that is here that's going to fight for them, and he's been leading them, but now he's moving around behind them. Well, do you think anybody's getting through him from the Egyptians to get to the Israelites? No. He's going to protect them. But then the pillar is also back there. So the pillar stood between them as well. It came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that one did not come near the other all that night. So the pillar moves around behind. So the Egyptians, they're in darkness. They can't see the camp of Israel. Israel's got light over on their side of the pillar, and so they can see what's going on, and so they're going to be able to, as the sea is parted, they're going to be able to walk across while the Egyptians don't see what's going on. It's going to give them time to get, because you say, I'm going to get 2 million people across the sea before the Egyptians and their chariots ride down on them. Well, this is how. God's protecting them, right? God's providing a hedge here for them. You would think so, but it says that God hardened their hearts. Why would you continue to pursue them after all the things that you've seen, right? It's stubbornness, right? It's arrogance, it's pride. We can't let these guys gain this victory over us. We're the army, right? Pharaoh should have sent us in right away to deal with this Israel problem, right? If he had sent us in right away, we would have taken care of things. And so maybe there's some arrogance on the part of the army as well, but they've got hard hearts as well as Pharaoh does. And in order, when you think about this, there's going to be this wall of water. Let's talk about that first. But what would it take to go marching in there, right? In verse 21, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground. The waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. So you got this division of the sea that takes place here, that God causes a wind to blow. In chapter 15 and verse 8, in Moses' song of victory, it talks about that God blew out of his nostrils, right? That God basically blew the Red Sea, blew a path in the Red Sea, and made dry ground for the Israelites to cross over on. Now, if you watch the History Channel, they're going to tell you that there's some sort of natural occurrence here where, this is the low water season, and so what happened here is that the waters just kind of stopped flowing, and so it just kind of dried up like a river that dries up. If you go up on the mountains here in the park, and it hasn't rained for a while, and you look over, you see a lot of rocks there, but there's no water in that stream. Why? Well, because it quit flowing because it hasn't rained in a while, right? There's no water coming down. And so they kind of get this idea, well, this is some sort of natural occurrence where there was just a wind, and it kind of dried the land out. Well, that doesn't describe a wall of water to the left and a wall of water to the right, does it? That's not flat, right, where it just dries up and there's no water there at all. But it says, the text says there's a wall of water on one side and a wall of water on the other. And I think it's in 1 Corinthians that it talks about them being baptized in the sea, right? So they're below the level of the sea. Now, if the sea is just gone because it's all dried up in that location, well, you can't get baptized. You can't get immersed below the level of the sea that way. So that passage wouldn't make any sense if that were the case. But there's a wall of water on both sides of them. And in Hebrews chapter 11, when the Hebrews writer talks about this particular event, it says, by faith, the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea on dry ground. Well, why would that have to be by faith? You'd have to have some trust and faith in God, wouldn't you? If you got a wall of water on this side and a wall of water on that side and you don't see anything holding it back, it's not like Ripley's Aquarium down there in Gatlinburg where you see the glass that's holding that shark back there, right? You got a wall of water on either side and we're going to go walking down through there. That would have taken some faith. For somebody that doesn't swim, that would have taken some faith to go walking down through there, right? And so they walked into the waters on dry ground. The Egyptians pursued them. Now, the Egyptians didn't go down there because they had faith in God. Right? The Egyptians went down there because they had hard hearts. And why would you not think, Israel's God is probably the one holding that water back. Maybe it's not such a good idea for us to go down in here right now. Right? Maybe this isn't, maybe we shouldn't be following Pharaoh. Pharaoh's likely on the shore saying, go get him, right? Because it doesn't appear that Pharaoh's down there when what happens.
And if you consider the Egyptian army was also reduced by the death of the firstborn, so they would all know that, and they would know of families, though most or many would not even be married, they would know of others who had lost the firstborn, and I think that would be the greatest hardness of heart that they would feel.
Well, yeah, and maybe we're going to get even for this, right? We're going to get even for this. It says, now it came to pass in the morning watch, in verse 24, back in Exodus 14. It came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. He took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians on their chariots and on their horsemen. So it looks like that the Israelites have gotten across, or they're far enough across that they're going to make it the rest of the way. And so the Egyptians start to come down into the midst of the sea, and it says that God troubled or confused the army of the Egyptians. So they get down there, and maybe all of a sudden their eyes are open to say, hey, we got water everywhere around us. So there's some confusion there as to what it is that they should do. It says he took off their chariot wheels, or he gobbed up their chariot wheels. Now, it could be that as the water's coming back, that dry ground is turning back to mud, but you've got a seabed, right? And the Israelites have walked across on the seabed, but the seabed was dried out by God, right? So holding the waters back and then breathing on that maybe caked that in mud, right? That's hard enough for the Israelites and for their livestock to walk across there. But maybe it's still soggy mud underneath that crust. And those chariots are pretty heavy. And maybe when those chariots get in there, they break through that crust into that mud and their chariot wheels. Now they can't get their chariot wheels, they can't turn around, right? You get stuck in a rut there. You can't get it to turn. They want to go back. They can't get it turned around, and things are just a mess. That's potentially could be what's going on here. I grew up in northern Ohio. We used to play football in all kinds of weather, and there was one winter where we had gotten, 6 to 8 inches of snow, and then we got like an inch of ice on top of that, and then we got like a couple more inches of snow on top of that. So we thought, boy, it'd be great to play football in that. We played football in everything up there. And so we're playing football, and as we're running along, every so often, your foot would break through that ice, and you'd kind of tackle yourself in the snow, Well, that kind of seems what's going on here, maybe that their wheels are breaking through, or the water's coming back. However it is that God did it, right? He took their wheels off or stopped up their wheels with their chariot, so this chariot's not going to do them any good at this point. And so they want to flee from the face of Israel. So the Egyptian army is like, this isn't working, let's get out of here, but it's too late for them to turn around and run back because Moses is going to stretch out his hand over the sea. In verse 27, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Then the water returned, covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. They're not going to see them anymore. They've seen their enemy defeated. They see them dead there on the seashore. Because, again, if there's a wall of water, which it repeats that there's a wall of water to the left and a wall of water to the right, it didn't just dry up. If it had just dried up, how could the water come crashing back down on the Egyptians when they went in? Right? The water would have to rise up. They'd have time to swim to shore. They'd have time to get out of there. But if it comes crashing back down on them, well, then they don't have any time to be saved. The Lord saved Israel, right? Physical redemption, physical salvation from the army of the Egyptians on that day. The Lord saved Israel that day, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt, so the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. There's another 3-point sermon for you, Casey, right? Israel saw the work that the Lord did, they feared the Lord, and they believed. They ought to have a healthy fear of the Lord at this point because they've seen the mighty things that he can do. They can see that he's got power over nature. He's got power over nations. He's more powerful than Egypt. He's able to bring them out and deliver them. He's able to deliver them from the Egyptian army when the people thought that they were as good as dead. It says they believed the Lord and his servant Moses. They believed God when they saw what had happened. They believed that Moses was God's spokesman because Moses said, here's what's going to happen, and then that's what happens. But again, it's short-lived. They believed Moses when he and Aaron first came in and performed the signs before he went in and talked to Pharaoh. They believed. Once Pharaoh said, I'm not letting you go and you can't have any straw, they didn't believe. Right now the people believe, but as they get into the wilderness and they've got to learn to trust God. They got to learn to have faith in God. They got to learn to depend upon God. Over and over and over again, they're going to forget what God has done for them, and they're going to have a lack of faith. They believe now, but that belief is going to be short-lived. Sometimes we believe when things are going good, we're all on God's side, and we think, boy, the Lord's been good to me, and the Lord's done all these things. And then when things turn bad, we tend to think that God's fighting against us or that God's not on our side. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. It's the world that we live in. Sometimes we're in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think it's in Ecclesiastes that Solomon wrote, time and chance happen to all of us. The race doesn't always go to the swift. The battle doesn't always go to the strongest. But time and chance happen to all of us. Sometimes we're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. We need to continue to have faith in God, no matter what, no matter if the going's hard or the going's easy. Sometimes when the going's hard, we think of God and we pray to him and ask him for help. When the going's easy, we tend to forget about God. But whatever our case is, we need to see the great work that God has done for us. We need to fear the Lord and fear not him who can kill the body but do nothing to the soul, right? Fear him who can throw both soul and body into hell. And believe, right? Have faith in God. We need to do those same three things. We're out of time. Any last minute comments, questions, snide remarks? Yes, sir. No.
So these people had God's promises before they left Egypt. They knew about Abraham. They saw all the miracles.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had opportunity to believe in God. So belief is something it's not something shallow. Belief in God is taking God at his word.
Right.
So when those people are walking through the Dead Sea, they got the wall of water on the left and on the right. It's a respect and it's a taking God at his word.
Yeah.
That's the same thing that we need today, to take God at his word.
Yeah. Yeah, we need to take God at his word. That's what having faith is, and you're right that there's evidence, right? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1. There's evidence for why we believe. It's not a blind leap in the dark. And it wasn't a blind leap in the dark for them either. They had known that someday that they were going to receive this land that was promised to Abraham. They knew a deliverer was coming. They saw the miracles and the plagues upon Egypt. And so there was evidence for their faith. There was a reason for them to believe in God. Good point. All right. Thank you.